So in this recording, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about your Module 1. Module 1 is basic device configuration. So what you're actually looking at here is really a review of what you learned in 125. So where do we leave off in Net 125? And that was with the configuration of your devices. That's what your final exam was on. So you're really picking up with that from here. So the first thing I wanted to bring to your attention is the topic objectives. So these are the objectives for Module 1. And the reason I'm pointing these out is I want you to kind of think of those as a study guide. So when you're looking at this and it says configure initial settings on a Cisco switch, when you get done with Module 1, make sure you know how to do that. Make sure you know how to configure switch ports to meet the network requirements, or configure secure management, verify connectivity, configure the basic settings on a router. So kind of use that as a checklist to make sure you know how to do all that stuff. So at the end of Module 1, if you can do all of those things, then you know that you've met the objectives for Module 1 and you should be prepared for your Module 1 through 3 exam. So the first thing that we're going to actually look at here is your switch boot sequence. So we did go over this in Net 125, but this is a reminder here. Make sure you know the boot sequence, because I have seen that on your Cisco exam where you're asked the Cisco boot sequence. So know the 5 steps. So power on self-test, and then it's going to load the bootstrap, or here it's called the bootloader software. Then you're going to see like the CPU initialization, registers, things like that. It's going to do that, and then the bootloader is going to initialize your flash and then your operating system. So here's the way I think about it. This is how all it's written in steps 1 through 5, but the way I think about it is your power on self-test. So it's going to do that, then load your bootstrap. Okay, so that kind of does some low-level software. Then it's going to load your operating system. Then it's going to look for your startup file. If it finds your startup file, it loads that. If it doesn't find the startup file, then that's when it's going to ask you if you want to enter the initial configuration dialog. And that's where it asks you if you want to enter that, and you do yes or no before you do any configuration on a Cisco device. If you're looking at the boot up file for a Cisco device, you will see it in flash. Okay, that's your flash memory. Because if you'll remember, you have different types of memory with a Cisco device. You have RAM, you have ROM, you have NVRAM, and you have flash. And flash is where your operating system is located. You'll also notice a couple of things when you're looking at your boot up file. Like, look at the 2960. This is a 2960 series switch. And you will also see it ends with a .bin extension. Okay, so make sure you know your file path. Some of the other things you want to look at are your LEDs. So a lot of people don't really think much of all the lights. You know, you just see pretty lights on a Cisco device. Well, they actually mean something. So make sure you know what each of the lights mean. For example, you've got your system lights. That's one of those, okay? Then you have each one of your other lights. They all indicate something different, whether you have power on, power over Ethernet. Okay, so what speed is being used? Is it using 10 meg, 100 meg? Okay. Your duplex, we're going to talk about that. Okay, so whether it's half or full duplex mode. Okay. So whether this one is lit or not, whether it's green indicates your port status. Okay. If it's green, it indicates the default mode, but now if you start seeing orange lights, then you know that there's an error. Orange or amber is how it might be listed. So each one of these has a different function. These can be very helpful for just kind of doing a general walk by on all your devices. For example, if the files get deleted out of Flash, which is your boot image file, you'll walk by and see all these lights just randomly flashing really quickly. When you're looking at your devices, you want to see all green. Now when they boot up, you'll see them flash a whole lot, and then you'll see them go from amber and then eventually green, and that's really what you want to see. So make sure you know each of those. Go through and also read on the recovering from a system crash and how you would do that. That walks you through that step, such as that the flash file. So if that accidentally gets deleted, it is very easy to delete a flash file. You would think it would not be. You would think there would be several prompts, but there's really not. For example, the command to delete your VLAN database is delete vlan.dat. Well, if you make a mistake on that command, you can type delete flash, because the entire command is delete flash vlan.dat. You're so used to abbreviating each of the commands. If you were to type delete flash.dat, it would delete the entire config file or entire operating system from your flash image. So with that being said, there is a way to restore that, and that's what this process right here walks you through. Now, you should know you're not used to using console cables remotely when you're remotely accessing all the equipment in NetLabs, but in the classroom, you're using a console cable. So when you're looking at Packet Tracer and you have that blue cable, that's what it actually is. So this is what gives you your connection to like terminal or hyperterminal to be able to configure the devices. And then this should be a good review for you. This is your configuration. So going into config T, and then interface VLAN, before you did interface VLAN 1. Well, this is 99, okay? But everything else is the same. So review this if you need to. If you need to review the commands and what each of those look like global config looks like this with the #. Get into interface configuration mode, you notice that that has parentheses around the config. If you get into the interface mode, notice it's a config if. So not only pay attention to the actual commands itself, but also pay attention to the prompts because they'll look different. And you may see this on Cisco exams, either in the Networking Academy or in the Cisco exam itself. You may know how to configure the IPv6 address, but may not know which interface to use to do that. So start paying attention to that if you're already not familiar with that. Make sure you go in and read this information as well on your switch ports. Review your full and half duplex communication. We did talk about that in 125, but just for review, full duplex can send and receive at the same time. Half duplex cannot. Now, most newer devices are in full duplex mode, and older devices are half duplex. And that's why we learned about the CSMA CD with Ethernet, the carrier sense multiple access with collision detection, because the devices were in half duplex mode. Full duplex mode, you should not have to worry about that. Now, just as a review, we've configured ports before, fast Ethernet ports, but here to configure it in a duplex mode, these are your steps. You can set the duplex mode and you can set the speed. These are a review of your show commands. We've used our show commands. In 125, we talked about those. So this is a good review for that. So you'll want to make sure you know how to use all your show commands really well. Gives you a good review. Now, so far we've used the show IP interface brief, but this shows you what it looks like if you were to do the show interfaces command. This is show interfaces fast Ethernet 018, and they show you a lot of detailed information here that you don't see in the show IP interface brief command. For example, some of the information that's kind of neat is the runts and the giants and the input errors. Do you remember the cyclic redundancy check or the CRC check that's done? This is where you would see that. Okay. The runts and giants refers to the size of an Ethernet frame. So there is a particular size that's accepted on frames. If it is less than the minimum size that's recommended, you would see it listed as a runt. If a frame is sent and is larger than the size that is typical, it would be listed as a giant. So that's what those are. And you would see, if you started seeing lots of errors, you would see them calculated here in the number of collisions. So that's what a lot of that information is. And of course, you have more detailed information here than what I just gave you. In 126, you're going to want to pay attention to your troubleshooting, and you're going to really want to hone in on that because that's going to be pretty significant in this course. With 125, you had very little troubleshooting, but 126 is going to be huge. It's not the most fun, especially when you're first starting out, and it can be very, very frustrating. But if you're going to be in IT, that's something you definitely want to know how to do, is do troubleshooting, because you're going to spend the majority of your time doing that. Now, you're learning how to configure routers and switches throughout your curriculum, but to be honest, that's really not what you're going to be spending most of your time doing when you're in the workplace, is configuring devices from scratch. If so, then there's a lot of issues in that network. So what you will be doing, though, is troubleshooting. So if you can hone in on those troubleshooting skills and get used to using all your show commands, then that's going to make you a better IT engineer. It's going to make you better at your job. So I would really highly recommend, spending some time and kind of embrace the whole troubleshooting aspect. So using your console cable is one way to connect to a device, and that's if you're sitting next to the device and you can connect your cable to it. But if you're not connected to it, if you're not in the same room, you're going to need to do remote. So that's why Telnet would need to be configured, or SSH. SSH is more secure than Telnet because it's encrypted. So this is what you're looking at through here, is how to configure SSH, because I don't think we did that in 125. We did Telnet. So you have a lot of commands here. You have several steps that you're going to go through by configuring the domain name, generating the key pairs, configuring your authentication, and then for the VTY lines, instead of transport input Telnet, it's transport input SSH, and then login local to require local authorization. And then here you're using SSH version 2, because you're supporting both versions of SSH. So you're going to get to walk through that, and I believe that is in this packet tracer on configuring SSH. Now the next part is on configuring your router, and this is something you did in 125. These are the same exact commands. So it's important to review those, because we're going to be building on that this semester. So please make sure you can do all of this just like you did in 125. This is just a good review. There's not a lot of new material in this chapter. Most of it, again, is review, and then we'll start building on it next semester. So you have another packet tracer here on configuring your router interfaces. And more of your show commands. So So that's what we see here. You'll also get really good at looking at your routing table. So you want to be able to interpret this routing table. Your goal should be able to look at a router's output and kind of piece together a map of your network based on the routing table from each router. We'll spend a little bit more time talking about that in later chapters. But like I said, for this week, you have a really good review of what you've done in 125 and kind of coming into your 126. So that kind of brings you to a module quiz. Now this is not something you have to submit. This is something you can do and you can practice. You can tell it to show you the answers if you get stuck on something, but just a good overview of what you've done. You do have packet tracers and labs. Now your labs, we are using NetLab, so make sure you follow your directions for that. And as usual, if you have any questions, please let me know. And then I'll be making another recording for next week. I don't have those assignments active yet, but I'll be activating those for you soon. But we'll be looking at switches and switching concepts and then getting into VLANs. So I will create another video for that for next week.